So yesterday, obviously, we talked a bit about the scorecard and my position on scorecards. Today, we'll talk about the project that I'm involved with and the way in which we have leveraged practitioner authors and also this concept of social learning and how those play out. And what I've tried to do is I will talk a little bit about our context, which is education leadership, but my belief, and I think what's beneficial or more beneficial for you, is for me to try to go back to the 40,000 foot view, or if you're in Atlanta, the ground view this week. But the 40,000 foot view and how it can be something that relates to whatever your context is. Because to me, these two categories are things that you might be able to take something back and utilize, regardless of the similarities or dissimilarities between our contexts. So, first of all, as I said yesterday, I'll talk a little bit more about what our program is. So the Pell's program, the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania is of the top-ranked education graduate schools in the country. It is probably one of the most focused on the merger between theory and practice. So a lot of times what you end up seeing at top-ranked academic institutions is this kind of really heady, we're very theory-oriented, we don't really care what you do with what we put out. We put out what we care about, and you take it and use it or don't. And we don't really care. But Penn actually is very focused on the merger with practice. And how, yes, theory is important, and yes, the scholars at Penn are top scholars in the field, but the focus is also on making sure that what we're doing is a merger between theory and practice, and this idea that theory should be informed by practice, and practice should be informed by theory, and it's this, circular process. So this led to the creation of the Penn Leadership Simulation Program, and this program actually is housed under a doctoral program that is a mid-career doctoral program. So it's a program for people who are in the middle of their education leadership careers. They're currently superintendents, principals, assistant superintendents, vice principals, very little bit of teacher leaders, but predominantly current sitting leaders come in, and they, for 3 years, work on a doctoral degree with peers while they're continuing to do their job. And so you can again see this commitment to the practice piece. And it's a what you learn today you put into effect tomorrow, which I think I probably just stole that from like the University of Phoenix's advertising material or something. So anyway, what we created then is this network of simulation writers or developers. We call them Pell's Fellows. They're mostly alumni of the mid-career doctoral program. Also, we have fellows from various professional associations that may not have had any direct affiliation with Penn before. So the American Association of School Administrators, which is no longer the American Association of School Administrators, it's just AASA now, like it's kind of like the Y is no longer YMCA. And they're the School Administrators Association. And then the National Association of Elementary School Principals and the National Association of Secondary School Principals. Each of those organizations has sponsored fellows who are part of our project. So again, sitting or recently retired practitioners who come in, and they are part of this network. And the goals of our which are roughly what they've been all throughout the program, is first of all capturing the lived experiences. And at one of our dinners, and I think Andy is out, but we were talking about phenomenology, and this is really phenomenology, right? Capturing the lived experiences. By the way, that's the theory. Phenomenology. I like to just say the word, so that's why I keep saying it. But phenomenology is capturing the lived experiences of these current leaders. One of the things that we see in education, this is not just true in education, it's true in a lot of fields, is a vacuum of people who are later in their careers who are leaving. And they're taking with them a tremendous amount of expertise. And that vacuum that's created once they're gone is going to be a lack of this lived experience or experiential knowledge. So the first goal of this project was to capture that so that it can then be used as supporting the learning of future generations of leaders and up-and-coming leaders. So there's that second piece, which is leveraging those lived experiences to support that in-service and pre-service professional development, which is peer-to-peer professional development, or P2P PD, which sounds like it could be a disease, I guess. But that's okay. So, and then we want to ultimately build a scalable library of simulations that can be used across leadership development. And sometimes these will be things that will disappear, they'll fall out, right? Common Core state standards is a big issue right now. So Common Core state standards might be substantively something that we would deal with. Maybe 5 years from now, Common Core is gone, that falls out of the rotation, but there's a lot of things that will be perpetual problems that we'll continue to have. So this is what our pilot simulations look like right now. Those of you who are using SimWriter will see things that look familiar to you. This is a simulation on a goal setting where the old school social studies teacher doesn't understand why he has to change his goals to match the school's goals, and this is what I've been doing every year, and now you want me to blah, 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 and how do you deal with him? We have a simulation I think I mentioned yesterday about the Board of Education meeting, and the parent goes into the Board of Education meeting and complains about the coach, and now you have to decide how to deal with that. And one of the things as I was putting this presentation together, I wanted to mention is this is an interesting theoretically best practice, right? So one of the things that we talk about in teaching is that students should know what the learning objectives are at the beginning, right? Because we want them to know what this thing is that we're doing, what we're teaching them, so that as they're learning it, they're making connections. Again, it's this advanced organizer concept that I mentioned yesterday. So if you know what, learner kind of drifts off, they're not paying attention, they look back up at the objectives and they say, oh yeah, that's what this is about, and they can get back into the learning moment. What we have made the decision in our simulations is not to put the learning objectives up front. We only present them at the end. And the reason that we do that is because if we put them up front, then there becomes a gaming that happens where the student, the participant, knows what you're trying to get them to learn to do. So if this simulation, which our intention of the board coach simulation, we call it the board coach simulation, has really nothing to do with investigating and dealing with the coach. It all has to do with addressing the parent and navigating the way that you manage the parent and the fact that the parent went over your head and what does that mean about the climate of the school and so forth. If we put that up front, then that changes the way that people will respond to the questions and the simulation in the learning experience. So I thought that was worthwhile to mention to you about our decision to do that. Again, despite the fact that it kind of runs in the face of some of the theoretical principles of instructional design. We've recently done our first full-frame video integration simulation where we're not in front of a green screen, we're in a live context and everybody is full frame. And it's a really good outcome, I think. Came out really nice. I will mention this. I don't know if people in this group will notice it. I'll mention it because whenever I talk to educators, they always ask. So you'll notice that this is all men. And it's all men because this particular version of this sim we're actually bringing over to Saudi Arabia because of a project that's happening in Saudi Arabia. And they actually said you could have women, but then they said, however, we'd like to preview everything that you have with women because if their shirt sleeves are not long enough and if their shirt tops come down too far, and we're like, we'll just do all men for the purposes of this initial example. But it's not that all of our work is something that somehow doesn't represent a diverse population. Okay, so now that I've spent 10 minutes talking about things that aren't really related to today's presentation, practitioner author model I'm going to talk about, and then I'm also going to talk about this social learning concept and how you can use simulations for social learning, some of which is things that many of you do already. So as I mentioned before, we have these Pell's Fellows. These are our practitioners. They are current, experienced leaders in K-12 schools, K-12 districts. Some of them are in magnet schools, some of them are in charter schools, some of them are in independent schools, religious and non-religious. Some of them are traditional schools and districts, and they're all different leadership levels. So they're principals, they're assistant superintendents, they're superintendents, they're director of technology, all of these different categories. And then the other thing that we do is we focus on micro simulations. Now, one of the things that I think happens in the world of at least leadership simulation, and it probably happens in some other simulation areas, is that our contexts are complicated. Forget about my technical term complicated from yesterday. But our contexts are complicated, and people in our contexts are dealing. If you're T-Mobile and you're training reps at a T-Mobile store, they're not just dealing with the one customer who's in front of them. They're also monitoring people who are coming into the store for shrinkage, and they're also answering a phone call, and they're also dealing with somebody who called out sick, and they're trying to reschedule while they're dealing with the customer in front of them. And so what ends up happening in many of our real contexts is that if we were to simulate the day in the life, the only skill that we can work on is prioritization. Because the sim then becomes all about, well, what do you do first? What do you do next? What do you do next? It's all about what your choices are in the order of what to do, and it doesn't allow you to get into the problem that specifically you're trying to teach and wrestle with. So what we've done is we've said we're taking very specific problems of practice that have actually been experienced by these school leaders, these complex situations I talked about yesterday. And they're taking a scenario and they're forgetting about the whole other world that interrupts them while they're dealing with that issue. So you have this sim that you just saw, the full frame is a sim that's called the teacher bully. And it has, as you might have imagined, the bully and the bully victim, okay? And basically, you're dealing with that scenario, okay? If you're a principal and you're in a school, at the same time that you're talking to the teacher who's concerned about that, there's also a radio call for a fight in the cafeteria, and you've also got the superintendent on line 3 wanting to know why you haven't turned in your budget, and you've also got the toilet overflowing in the girls' bathroom, and you've got to deal with it because the custodians are all at a mandatory training with a simulation on hazardous materials. And this is the life of it, but you have to say, so if we say, okay, well, what do you do first? Do you fix the toilet? Do you, and guess what? Then the conversation never gets to how to deal with the bully teacher and how you're going to think about processing that. So all of our practitioner simulations are built on what we call micro simulations. Okay, we eliminate the noise. We eliminate the question, the macro question of prioritization. Now, sometimes within an issue, you have to decide what to do first or second or third, and there is in-issue prioritization, but not macro prioritization. That's still in there, but not the kind of day in the life, what do I do first, what do I do second type thing. Now, so I call this kind of going beyond the SME, the practitioner author model. It's going beyond a consultative subject matter expert, and it's taking subject matter experts, practitioners, and having them write the simulation. They're writing it, they're deciding on the choices, they're deciding on what happens next after each of those choices, and so on and so forth. And actually the ideal scenario, I'm not trying to write any of you out of jobs. The ideal scenario is to have an instructional designer who's part of that authoring team. Because one of the things that we found is that we have trouble getting everything written. So, when we have an instructional designer who is working with us, who says, okay, yes, this is a great conversation, but it's not really relevant to what you're working on. So let's get back to the simulation. Or, okay, do you really think you need 4 choices at this point? Could you do 3? And, what are those kinds of considerations, and helping us process through those, that pairing is very, very helpful. And we also actually do, so we call this social authoring professional crowdsourcing, because we author as a large group. We have multiple different simulations happening at the same time. But when there's issues that come up, we kind of come out of our authoring teams and we go to the whole group and we're talk them through as a whole group. Well, should we deal with this particular issue? Is it central enough? Does it matter? So we had a simulation that I mentioned, I think yesterday, about dress code, and a teacher was violating a dress code, and we were deciding whether or not we should include in the simulation the decision of whether to have a second person in the meeting when you're talking to the teacher who's inappropriately dressed. And ultimately we decided no, because of the way we wanted the immersive experience to be. But we talked it through, and we talked about the fact that, that is such a contextual question. It matters if the player were a male versus a female. It matters if there's a history. It matters how your office is set up. So, my office was a big glass. There was a glass on all four. I was we called it the fishbowl. Right at the front of the school, the secretaries in the main office could see into me, and the front entrance could see into me. And it was not built. It was built after the school shootings, but it was not built with that thinking in mind, really. It's a very exposed spot. But basically, could I say something wrong? Sure. But is it possible that that no one would not be seeing every move that I made? So I couldn't have done anything that would have been physically threatening or physically inappropriate or what have you. And so that after that discussion, we said, that discussion is something that can come up in part 2 of this social learning piece, but it doesn't need to be in the simulation. That doesn't need to be in the simulation. Well, we professionally crowdsourced this. We had the group talking about it, and the decision to not include it was a group decision by other people who've all been in these kinds of circumstances. So that's this professional crowdsourcing, and the working in teams. So you have a person whose problem it is, they're the lead author, but they have a co-writer who's also a practitioner, so that they're moving through this process together. And what we consider this to come out, and I'm going to talk a minute more about experiential validity is what we call it, that the simulation then has this experiential validity. It's valid and feels valid because it is based on real experiences. The other thing that I think is important is standards alignment, and a lot of times if you're not a practitioner, and it's not, and even if you have a great subject matter expert, if you're not a practitioner, there's this, the way that standards are considered in your environment, in the environment that you're working on a program about, is varied, right? So there may be a set of standards that your client says, we want you to use these standards, or that your company or that your boss says, we're, ISO 9005 or whatever thing there is out there. Or it could be the standards of the IEEE convention of 1977. Eric's gone, Shiblam's gone, so I don't know if that's an exact real thing that exists. But we have the ISLIC standards in education, the Interstate School Leadership Licensure standards. And they're called ISLIC, they're not called ISLC, and so how they're written in matters, but also that people would know what levels of those standards practitioners actually know and use. And that is also valuable, because when you throw in standards, because you are required to align to some kind of standards, if they're standards that practitioners don't care about, use, or know, it is of little value. And I'm going to be honest, I have standards in my syllabi for the courses that I teach in the graduate ed school, pages of standards for accreditation purposes that just make the syllabus 25 pages, that my students are not getting value out of seeing those standards. They're not thinking and internalizing them. They're just there for a pro forma purpose. It's much more powerful if they're there and they're standards that are recognized and that the end users know and say, that's an important standard. And the practitioner authors know what those are and where they are. So this concept of experiential validity is this question of, are the scenarios real? And again, we had the conversation yesterday about how real is too real, and that's a very important, reasonable conversation. But to go to Will's points, does the situation have the real cues that really matter, right? We could do a pirate school if we're writing this simulation, and we would still know what we needed to do to make it feel real because we've been in those experiences. Okay, we, meaning the practitioner authors in this case. Okay, are the consequences and outcomes realistic? Right? Again, are those things that are consequences, are they things that really happen? Are they things that could or would play out that way? Are the intended learning objectives or the alignment to the standards actually explored in a way that's meaningful and in a way that makes those decisions? Are the decisions or choices grounded in theory? So this is that merger of theory and practice. Did the decisions that were made, do those connect to you as a now you wouldn't bring in a novice to write a simulation. You would bring in an experienced veteran practitioner who knows what lies beneath the experiences that you're trying to train people on. So that's an important question. And then the other piece is this vernacular of practice, a term I made up this morning. So the vernacular of practice is kind of the natural use of this as a first language. How do principals talk to parents? What words do they use? How do they say things? What words don't they use? Even if you have a SME who tells you, oh, don't do this or do that, they're not thinking about every single possible combination. It's not a dynamic process, right? I mean, you try to make it dynamic, especially if you've learned from some of the presenters here and so forth. You try to make it as dynamic as possible, and there's reviews and back and forth, but it's not natural, right? So vernacular is kind of the natural language that you have. It is the natural things that you don't think to tell somebody else that you would or wouldn't say. So I go back to ISLIC, right? The way we in our field pronounce ISLIC is another example. I don't know if anybody ever saw. There was a movie. Last night we were talking about movies and music. There was a movie in the 80s, I'm guessing, called Super Fuzz. It's about, well, I don't remember who what was his name, who was the cop in that movie, the super power guy. Does anybody remember that movie? No, it was the boss was a black man and Super Fuzz was a white guy, and I think it might have been Judge Reinhold, but I'm not certain. So, and basically the storyline, the connection here is like, so he goes in and he's going to become this cop in this precinct, and it was like the 22nd precinct in New York City. And he says that, like, so this is the 22nd precinct, and the boss says to him, we don't call it the 22nd precinct, we call it the 2-2. And then he says, oh, so this is the 2-2? And he goes, it's not the 2-2, it's the 2-2. Right? That is the vernacular of practice, right? It is those subtle distinctions. And so ISLIC versus ISLLC, those little things are the cues that will totally turn off your users if you say them or do them or whatever else. And sometimes your SMEs are 3 points removed from the person who's actually being trained. So your SME for service rep, when you're doing a training for the store service reps, is probably the district manager or higher who hasn't been a service rep either ever in this particular business or for a long time. And maybe nobody refers to the cash register as the terminal anymore, but your SME still thinks it's called the terminal, and the users are going to be like, what the heck is the terminal? So these are the kinds of things that you get in this vernacular of practice. So first of all, I see that last of all, or summarizing this practitioner author model, I see there's two layers of advantage here. And the first layer is what I've just been talking about, which is really advantages in the product, right? Which is authenticity, it's experiential validity, it's buy-in. Why is it buy-in? Because the users know that somebody who is like them wrote the simulation. And they then say, so this is something that is coming from us. And if it's generative like that, then it adds buy-in for the users. And so many of us, regardless of how hard we try in immersive learning as a world to make trainings more engaging and more meaningful, we all still have experiences where people come to their trainings and they're like, okay, I need to get back and do my job, right? And the buy-in is not there. And if they know that these simulations are written by them ostensibly, that increases the buy-in right off the bat. It's an ethos that will improve their willingness and motivation to learn. But I also think that this process has an advantage in the process. So the other thing that happens is that we have these really advanced practitioners, these people who do the job really well. And guess what? your compliance training module is not going to make that person better because they're already great. They already do the things the company wants them to do or the school system wants them to do. They're already good at it. So if you want to make them better, have them write the scenario. Because if they write the scenario, then they start to build systems thinking and they start to think about, well, what happens if you do this a different way? Not the right way, quote unquote, or not the best way, or not the way I would do it. What are the implications of that? And you know what? Then when they become a manager or when they become a senior leader, they've thought about these processes. Or they've thought about what happens when they get a weird reaction from a customer that they didn't anticipate before. Because they've thought it through in writing. And so the writer is a way of, what I say, differentiating up. So very often our trainings are meant to bring people to some minimum level of competence. Right? And that is a necessity. But we have people who are higher, we can have a higher regard for. Right? And any of you that have ever watched Undercover Boss, you all know that at the end of that, they always bring that one poor schmo who's mopping up to be the training developer for the moppers because they realize that, wow, no one knows that if the mop bucket was so small, we can't fit the mop in it. And that would, this practitioner is, they bring it up. But you know what it does then is it builds an esprit de corps. It makes people feel valued. These are huge things that can advantage your training program. Leverage the process, just the process. So what's our next step? What Brandon and I talked about actually last night is, now maybe he had a couple of cocktails, so maybe he wasn't really meaning this, but what we talked about last night is the idea that we now have a space, now that we have this full frame video, and now that everybody has their iPhones and their camera phones and this and that, we now have a space where we can start to actually have our practitioner authors become the talent and the media producers with their iPhone in their offices. Right? Go into, and I only because I know that T-Mobile is one of our groups here, go into a T-Mobile store and have this person who's your subject matter expert now, practitioner, author, video in the store, a person dealing with a fake customer, have one of your employees be the customer, have another employee be the cash register, whatever the job is, the customer service rep, whatever it is, have them video it. First person video from that. Now you've got, talk about authenticity, talk about feelings of realism, and talk about connectedness to the product, okay? So that's our next attempt. That's our next step for this. Okay. By the way, we've always thought about wanting our practitioner authors to be the talent, even if we weren't doing the videoing. We've only done that to a limited extent by bringing out, and I'll just go back really quickly to show you, Ryan is a district coordinator of language arts, and he is a colleague of mine from my doctoral program. He's real, right? Although sometimes when the green screen, people say, is he real or is he an animation? But not only is he real, but he's also really the person that he plays. And it's funny because I'm going to mention in a minute Ambient, which is a product, some of you have seen it, former ILUs and so forth. But I guess the simulation with that was at last year's ILU with the doctor, right? And some of you might remember that or seen this demos of that. And after that, some people were like, "Well, we'd like to where can we talk to that doctor? I have that medical problem. I'd like to talk to that doctor." And apparently, and no, he's not a doctor, right? I just play one on TV. But there is an advantage again in all of the things I talked about with practitioner authors to bring in the practitioners as the actors, as the talent. And it also builds in that authenticity and it allows them to play those roles. Sometimes playing the parent that's a pain in the ass is helpful in understanding what it's like to be the parent who's a pain in the ass, which again might not impact the players of the simulation, but it impacts the principal who played the parent that's a pain in the ass the next time they deal with a parent who's a pain in the ass. How many times did I say ass, Brandon? Okay, so social learning with simulations is this idea of immersive experiences. One of the things that immersive learning does one of the things that simulations do is it provides multiple different people with a shared experience. So if we go to a principal's meeting and we want to talk about a disciplinary problem, well, it's me as a principal of the high school formerly, me as a principal of the high school, and there's a principal from the other high school, and then there's 4 elementary school principals there, and there's a middle school principal there, and we're going to talk about this issue that we had with a kid. Well, it's not necessarily in all of our minds. What are we talking about here? So the simulation becomes the shared experience that now we can talk about a specific experience that we have all now had in common. And we can talk about how we're dealing with it and what's going on with it. So rather than coming with real experiences that are isolated, we can have a shared experience around an issue that we are concerned about in the district, and then we can process it together because we've all had the same experience. And then that can allow us to engage in critical thinking around the problem, and it can allow us to have difficult conversations. Because most of the time people are afraid to say, well, they don't want to say, well, why would you do that? Because they say, what do they always say? They say, well, I wasn't there, so I don't know why he might have done that or not, right? Well, you can say, why did you do that in the simulation? Because you were there. You did the same simulation. You've made different choices than that person did. And then you're put in a position where you're not challenging them and their practice. You're challenging the practice, not their practice. Okay? So that's a really important point, and we have that opportunity. The other thing that social learning does is it allows us to clarify organizational decision-making values and the things that we want to be considered in those decision-making. So yes, you can have direct instructional objectives and learning outcomes. And you can then do a simulation that is supposed to teach these learning outcomes or that might touch these learning outcomes. But it doesn't bring to the forefront the discussion of the organizational decision-making values. It doesn't put that in the conversation. It's about those specific issues. When we get into social learning, we can surface what the real decision-making values are of our players, and then also how those do or don't seem to align with what we really mean for the company or the organization to do. So it's this idea of, we talk about it a lot in our program, of removing the black box, the cover on the black box of decision making. Because if you're a manager of a store, or you're a bank auditor, and you work a lot of the time in isolation in your lane, you don't get to talk to other people about why you decided to do the things you did in your lane. You just do them, right? And at some point we can rewind far enough back in the process. So even in the case of the FDIC, where they're working in teams and there are other people to talk to, they're generating in their own mind rationales that they go to the team to talk about. Well, how did they decide on the rationale? We've got to take the cover off that black box with other people who are also deciding on those rationales. And this applies in the simple or complicated contexts, or in the complex context that I talked about yesterday. Because in the simple and complicated contexts, a lot of times what we have a tendency to do, especially simple, is teach the response by rote. This is what you're supposed to do. And then what ends up happening is they face a slightly different version, and they don't know what to do because they've never learned how to think about analyzing the problem. They've only learned how to respond to a specific problem. And so, and I will do my little medicine, healthcare talk. And I told you yesterday, my wife's a physician. And how many of you have gone to your primary care doctor and seen the nurse practitioner or physician's assistant and not your actual doctor at some point? Or you brought your kids, or they said to you, do you want to see the doctor? And you can wait for 3 days, or you can come in today and see the nurse practitioner or whatever, right? Okay. What's the difference between doctors and nurse practitioners? Doctors and physician's assistants, and this is not begrudging nurse practitioners or physician assistants. Nurse practitioners and physician's assistants learn the flow chart. They don't learn the structure and function that underlies the problems and the issues. The 4 years of medical school is not a flow chart. The 4 years of medical school is not how to treat particular ailments. It's an understanding of how the body systems interact with each other and what this kind of gas level in blood means, and this and that and all these. And all of a sudden, if you have a nurse practitioner see you, 95% of the time they're going to do as good or better job than the doctor, because they deal with the ear infection every time, every day, blah, 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 blah. That's what they know how to do, and they see it and they look and they know and they know. But if there's something unusual, they may not even catch it, because they don't know the bigger. Their paradigm is only what they know, and not to think about what else is out there. And that is what social learning can do, is it can allow the discussion about, why did we say you should do this? Why are you supposed to always offer the customer this or that before anything else? Not just always offer the customer this or that before anything else, but why? Because if you know the why, then when there's a situation that maybe you shouldn't offer the customer this or that, even though that's the rule, you will have a way to process that or think through that. Okay? And then it helps also make explicit the rationale why people made the choices. And that goes back to the black box. It's, in other words, let's talk about why we made the choices we made. Why did you choose that thing? And you know what? As the trainers or as the leadership of the organization, we should be listening to those conversations, because there may be a choice that is not the choice we want them to make that they're making. Why are they making it? Maybe there's something we don't realize is going on at that on the ground, boots on the ground level that we should be adjusting to and adapting to. So what does this social learning look like? Well, it can take multiple different forms. It can be multiple different options. First of all, you can take simulations and you can do them in whole group. And I mentioned Riccardo Saetti's ambient, which is cinematic. How does he say it? Cinematic. Yes, is that what he says? Cinema, right? Where it's designed, and ambient is designed to take the simulation and make it on the screen in front of the whole audience. But guess what? No offense to Riccardo, SimWriter can be put up on an LCD projector in a whole room too. Okay? So you could put a SurveyMonkey text simulation up on the big screen, right? Whatever you want to do. So the point is that you're using, the whole group is looking at the same picture, the same steps, the same phases, one step at a time together, right? And then within that, there are different ways of managing that discussion. You can do turn and talks, where I put up a simulation, the scenario happens, the question is there, and I say, okay, turn to the person next to you, talk about what decision you each might want to make in this case. You give them 30, 45 seconds, a minute, and say, okay, so what is our choice? Show of hands for choice 1, show of hands for choice 2, or clickers, or whatever you have in your training capacity. Now they've had an opportunity to process, to think through, to make their reasoning clear to a person next to them. Then you make the choice and you see what happens, and if you want, you can have a whole group discussion at that decision point. Warning, warning, warning. This reduces immersiveness, right? If you have the discussion in the middle at the decision points, it pulls them out of the first person scenario. So Riccardo would say, bring the lights up, and then have the discussion, dim the lights. When you put the cinema back on, it makes you feel like you're back in the moment, right? I don't know the extent to which I'm concerned about that or not. So, but Riccardo's very concerned about it. And you might be, and you can do those things. But the other thing you can do is you can have participants complete the entire simulation individually and then come to the whole group discussion with questions, conversations around specific decision points. And if you're going to do that, then the direction I would take is to give some sort of a graphic organizer that has prompts on it. Why did you decide what you decided at this moment? Give a space, or what was your decision with respect to blah, 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 and why? This will guide them so that they come to the meeting with notes that they can talk about, rather than you saying, so somebody tell me what they thought was a hard decision in this scenario. They're not going to remember. They're not going to know. So give them some kind of guide that they can bring with them completed. More about what it looks like. Another option is a small group process, round tables, 3 to 6 people at each table, one laptop. They're working on the simulation together at the table. One user, but they're discussing as they go, making decisions about what to do. They're discussing as they face the choice. Hybrid, you do that small group, then come back. You give them that that sheet where they can make notes about issues that the graphic organizer, they make notes about the issues they faced, the conversations they had. Then you come back as a whole group and you say, what was the most difficult discussion that you had in that whole simulation? Where did you find the most discord? Where was the most agreement? You know, those kinds of questions that you guided them on when they're in the moment anyway. Then you also remember Quinn yesterday mentioned how his assertion that the best way to train is expert mentors in live practice, I think was exactly how he framed it. So that's like law enforcement. If you have family members or friends who are police officers, they go to the academy and they learn, and then they go on the road, and the first 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 14 weeks that they're on the road, they have a veteran officer with them at every step of the way. And that veteran officer then, like, for the first 4 weeks does everything as the lead, and the other person just watches, and then the next 4 weeks the veteran officer, still in uniform, steps back and acts kind of like the partner, and the first person leads. And then the last 4 weeks the veteran officer now wears jeans and a t-shirt, and the other new officer is in the lead for the whole call, and the veteran officer is really just there in case the shit hits the fan. Okay? And that's the live example. Now, we might not be able to do that, but we can do mentors that utilize simulation, and you can have this is still social, a one-on-one mentor sitting next to mentee, and they go through the simulation together and they talk through as they go. So if you have a lead customer service rep in a store, they can sit down during downtimes during the day and go through the simulation with each of their employees together. And then they can talk about these issues as they arise. Why does the company care if you greet every customer within 35 seconds or whatever? What is the reason for that? Let's talk about it. Haven't you ever gone into a store and you've never felt like you were seen? Why? That's what we want. We want our customers to feel seen. And they're like, well, what about, we used to call it when I worked at the electronics boutique when I was in high school, the grenade greeting. Hi, welcome to Electronics Boutique, from the back of the store, right? Why is that a problem, right? We call it the grenade, right? But why is that a problem? And you can talk about that and have that discussion and that dialogue. That's another way of doing social learning. The other thing, and this goes to our data collection, which I go back to Andy's comments, is there's this fear with data that it's being collected, because it is. And one of the things that you can do with social learning is you can diminish that fear, because people know they can't tell if it's me, right? And so if you're having a small group do the simulation, everybody can be more honest, because no one's worried about them being the one who said the wrong answer. So that's another thing that when we're talking about big data, and I'll talk about data collection on the plus side in this last slide. I think this is the last slide, yeah. So I was talking to a group of superintendents who are writing simulations now for this new National Superintendent Certification Program that's happening. And I was talking to this group, introducing our first simulation in this process for them. And after we did the first couple of phases of this simulation, and they were really into it and really engaged, and they said, okay, do you have any questions about the process, or what this experience, why we're doing this? And one of the superintendents raised his hand and says, why are you really doing this, right? And this is so I answered, and this is kind of what my answer was. First of all, our real genuine reason is leadership development, what I mentioned before, pre-service and in-service school leaders. Second place that we're trying to build out is a way to influence and enhance our hiring processes. So if you have a simulation of what you want a customer service representative to do, add it to your hiring process. Now, by the way, check with legal before you do. But that's just my plug for lawyers. Let a person take that simulation, do that simulation, and you're not going to give them, you pull out all the feedback. There's no feedback in that simulation. Okay? Turn off the feedback option in SimWriter. And instead of feedback, have them write why they made each choice that they made. And now you have a practice example about how this person is going naturally, without training, to respond to your customers or to deal with circumstances that come up in your environment. And you want to talk about, my mom used to do personnel and human resources hiring, and she always talked about behavioral interviewing, right? This is the epitome of behavioral interviewing, because you've immersed them in a situation and you've now seen how they respond in the situation that is you as a company. there's not a really better piece of information you can get, because what also can happen is if you're dealing with behavioral interviewing and you give a question and the person gives the wrong answer, this is not a good example because the person didn't redeem themselves, but I did an interview once for a science teacher, a high school science teacher, and she had a zoology background. So we're like, this could be really cool. We were hiring for a biology position. She comes in and she says, I don't really believe in an interactive classroom. I prefer the didactic. Okay. Yeah, exactly. And she says, do we have access to a copy machine? Really? Because I need to know, on my current school, we can't make dittos. Okay. You're out of here, right? But the thing is that maybe there's a reason that she said that because we tuned out, because I gave my team the cue that we're going to the last question. We always had a cue that it's time to jump to the last question because we're done with this person. But we're not going to go through the rest of the interview. And then I said, we have time for one question from you. But the thing is, maybe there was a reason. Maybe she had come from an experience where students never had textbooks, and she has found a way to make resources for them that made her sound really creative and great, right? And we never would have heard that because we jumped to the last question and said, see you later, and never thought about it again. But if you do a simulation, even when people make the quote-unquote wrong choices, if you let them write their rationale, you might realize that they really have something that is what you're really looking for. And so you get that because it's kind of like an email, right? The person says everything in the email. If you were going to stop them, they don't get cut off because they go through the whole process. So you'll get to see, and you'll be probably like laughing and be like, let's see how they explain this one. And then you'll read it and you'll be like, wow, that makes sense. This is a person we might want to give a chance to. And then big data, back to Andy's comments, is this idea of research and evaluation. So when you do capture, you have this ability to capture with SCORM and EdTPA X516 and whatever other the new technologies are that are coming out and coming in and whatever, to capture click level data. You can see if they changed their mind before they submitted the decision. If you're training 1,400 customer service reps, one of the first things I would want to know is not what we're trying to teach them, but what are their instinctual responses? Because if 950 of them choose choice A, and we really want them to choose choice B, we should be revisiting why we want them to choose choice B. Okay, it's the 80% rule with speed limits. 80% of the cars will go the right speed limit for the road without any speed posted. 80% of the cars, 20% will speed, but 80% of the cars will go the right speed. And the way they do traffic studies, absent some weird thing, like there's a deaf child that lives at this house, absent some weird thing is they monitor what the speed is of all the cars that go by. And they say that 80% go 40 miles an hour, that's the speed that this road is safe to drive at. Well, if 90% of your CSRs are responding to a question this way, that may be the right way to answer the question. It at least merits an investigation. And the thing is, we have all this data, and a lot of times we get single-minded to think that the only value we have is imposing information on them, rather than thinking about how much they can teach us. And that is a really important point. So, and that's my last point. So, I don't know, I'm over or done or time, so I don't know where we're at. So.
Excellent.
Okay? All right, thank you. This is my computer.